Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor, as always, and turns out I'm also a StarCraft lore nerd. Who knew? And as a result, I'm bringing you my opinions on the newly released StarCraft Evolution novel. Now, I split the video into 3 parts. First and foremost, I'll do a general look at the book, my review so to say, which I will try to maintain as spoiler-free as I can. And then I'm going to go through a more or less detailed run-through of the plot, and basically from there on there will be spoilers, obviously. And after that particular rundown of the plot, I'm going to move on and analyze specific characters, and the impressions I've had of specific ones, or my overall feelings on them in this book, and so on and so forth. I will say that I'm not going to spoil absolutely everything, and even if I did, if I had known the plot beforehand, I still would have liked this book, and I would recommend it. Anyway, first and foremost, did I think it was a good book? Yes, I definitely did. Timothy Zahn is a successful author for a reason, you know. In many ways, this book reminded me of some of his work for the Star Wars universe, namely the Hand of Thrawn duology, and the plot of this book does share, in a way, some similarities with that one. Again, no spoilers yet. I thought the book was well written, it was very action-packed and very tense. One thing to note is that this takes place 6 years after Legacy of the Void, and I'm also 90% sure that it takes place after Nova Covert Ops, the mission pack. So as an indirect result, this book does spoil the outcomes for both of those. The book features 2, sometimes 3 storylines which run in parallel and are obviously connected with each other, and all of these are interesting and feature good characterization and storytelling, I feel. Most of this book is a sort of mystery novel, and the mystery is handled fairly well, although I will talk about that more in the spoiler sections. I will say that I disliked several things on the book. Firstly, there are times when the author kinda just leaves the scene unfinished. He sort of lets us, the reader, fill in the gaps, and then he moves on to one of the other storylines. And that's where my second issue comes in. While I found all of the characters to be interesting and fairly well written, some are more interesting than others, and I have to say that there were times when I was frustrated because the author closed off a chapter right when something interesting was about to happen. And my third complaint is that while the book does a pretty good job on developing the characters, it doesn't focus as much time as I'd like on furthering StarCraft's story. I will say that the book brings a very interesting development to the StarCraft universe, which could be expanded upon, but it doesn't really bring that development to a satisfying end. It kind of leaves it open-ended. I would also mention that the book is filled with character development and subplots for each individual character almost. And there are almost too many of them, really. It's kind of hard to keep track of each individual subplot. And even the authors seem to have this problem, as some of the subplots don't really reach a satisfying end, or don't even end at all. I'll elaborate on this more in the spoiler section. Other than these complaints, there isn't really much I can say without spoiling the book. It is a good read, it is very tense like I said, and I would recommend it to any StarCraft lore nerd who does not wish to have Nova Covert Ops indirectly spoiled for them. Just beware that you might finish the book feeling somewhat unsatisfied, but that's more of a fault of the ending rather than of the contents of the novel themselves. One other minor thing is that at BlizzCon, the author, Timothy Zahn, said that the book was intended for new readers of the StarCraft universe and people who did not really know the lore. I kinda disagree, honestly. There's quite a few things that wouldn't really have made sense if I hadn't known the lore personally. And I don't know if someone unfamiliar can really follow all the aspects of the story. Now, if you've played the games, you're set, I think. You'll understand 99% of what is happening. But then again, there are occasional snippets which are easier to digest by a lorehound. Alright, so let's do a fairly quick summary of the plot. Be warned that from now on, spoilers are in full thrust, spoilers will take place, be ready. The story, like I said, takes place 6 years after Legacy of the Void, and after we defeated Amon, and after Kerrigan has ascended and become a Xel'Naga. The novel is told exclusively from the point of view of the Terrans, so we only get the Zerg and Protoss side filtered through them, so to say. There are also, like I said, 2, sometimes 3 stories running in parallel. First and foremost, the centermost story is of the quote-unquote team, which does most of the dirty work in the book, which is composed of various characters. One thing that I liked about the novel is how it introduced these characters, namely by giving them 2 respective chapters in the beginning of the book. The first chapter is about the Marine Sergeant Whist, a veteran, and him meeting the Reaper Lieutenant Diz, which is a fairly well written and kind of funny chapter. Diz tricks the Marine into criticizing a Reaper training squad, and when said squad comes to kick Whist's butt, Diz comes to the scene, pulls rank, and tells them to fix their mistake basically, and the 2 then go drinking in the officers' lounge. The second chapter is about the ghost on the point of retirement, Tanya, and the Protoss researcher Ulavu. Ulavu is described as an exile of his people who lives on Core Hall 4 in the Ghost headquarters and assists the Terran Dominion while also being close friends with Tanya, who otherwise doesn't really have friends. Only in this chapter, Ulavu decides to take a stroll around the city and winds up in a bar filled with survivors of Chaussara, namely the first Terran planet incinerated by the Protoss. Whoops. So Tanya has to rescue him from the bar, and this serves as the establishment of their respective characters. The final member of the team, the scientist Erin, is introduced a bit later on somewhat, although she does have an important role in the plot. Now, I'm going to focus less on the characters when I explain the overall plot, and instead tell the more or less general story and the implications it has on the StarCraft universe. I'll talk plenty about the quote-unquote dream team, as I'm going to call them, and the other characters when I get to the character section. Now, the main plot begins when a Zerg Leviathan, helmed by a queen and mostly unarmed, arrives in the Core House sector and begins broadcasting that the Zerg planet of Gist is under attack by the Protoss, and Zagara, the Overqueen of the Swarm, requests the Dominion's assistance. Thing is, Gist was incinerated a while ago by the Protoss, so it should have been uninhabited. So this is an unusual situation, and Emperor Valerian, along with Matt Horner, the dream team I talked about, and the landing squad under one Colonel Kruskshank, board the Hyperion and decide to see what's what. When they arrive, they find the Protoss fleet under Artanis, and together discover that Zagara tricked them into coming to the planet so that they may discuss peace and reconstruction after the war. She claims that the Swarm found choice after Kerrigan ascended, and they are now able to assist the recovering Terrans and the Protoss. Indeed, the whole planet of Gist has been revitalized and is now a jungle teeming with life, thanks very much in part to many pieces of Xel'Naga genetics which the Zerg have received from Kerrigan. There's a lot, and I mean a lot, of suspicion on the part of the Protoss, specifically, and the Terrans, but they agree to discuss things with Zagara on the planet. Zagara also agrees to allow the Terrans and the Protoss to send survey teams on the planet. So this is where the plots kind of split up. Valerian and Artanis go to discuss things with Zagara and Abathur, while the quote-unquote dream team goes to check out one of the 3 unusual spots on the planet. Now, without going into too many details, they find some hostile Zerg, and among them some very unusual ones, some new ones, which are capable of psionic attacks. They then incinerate, as a precaution, a gigantic, I suppose you could call it a tree filled with sacks, presumed to contain these psionic Zerg in their infancy, sort of like eggs, so to say. So this incident obviously threatens to undermine the negotiations. Zagara is furious that said tree was destroyed, which she claimed was completely harmless, and denies the existence of these hostile Zerg, while Abathur also calls the Terrans liars. Artanis later on leaves the negotiations while Valerian stays behind, trying to find a bridge between the Protoss and the Zerg and to salvage the negotiations. I'll expand on this in the character section, but I really liked how Valerian was put into the role of a sort of mediator between Artanis and Zagara, despite the fact that he himself is working together with the Protoss. Anyway, the plot moves on as the quote-unquote Dream Team is sent towards the third quote-unquote tree on the planet, while the Protoss examine the second quote-unquote tree. The Protoss are immediately attacked by a massive Zerg force, and Valerian sends part of his admittedly small ground forces to assist them. The Terrans help defeat the Zerg with immense casualties to themselves, but especially to the Protoss, who then completely destroy the second quote-unquote tree, again much to Zagara and Abathur's displeasures. The negotiations break down, though Zagara insists on maintaining the truce and still refuses to believe the existence of hostile Zerg. Around this time, or perhaps earlier, the book establishes that these new psionic Zerg must be taking control from Zagara's Zerg, and using these Zerg to attack the Terrans on the Protoss. Around this time as well, the characters realize that these new psionic Zerg are different from the quote-unquote trees and the creatures those quote-unquote trees housed. In fact, the psionic Zerg were trying to goad the Terrans and the Protoss into destroying these quote-unquote trees. But again, we do not yet know why or who is responsible for what happens. I have to say, I will develop on this in the character section, but I figured out almost from the beginning who the bad guy was and his motivations. Though I do not blame the in-universe characters for not knowing, since they themselves knew almost nothing of the character itself. I only knew because I interacted with said character in-game, and I know how it thinks. Take from that what you will. Anyway, the quote-unquote dream team is on its way towards the third quote-unquote tree. All the while, Valerian is constantly talking to Artanis, trying to persuade him not to glass the planet and the Zerg, while Zagara and Abathur themselves have gone missing. The Terrans come up with a plan to fire a psi emitter to distract the Zerg from the third quote-unquote tree, so that the team can reach it safely in their dropship, only for the dropship to be snagged by some Mutalisk heading for the psi emitter. At which point, while the team clears out the Mutalisks, the Hyperion has no choice but to nuke the psi emitter and the Zerg attracted to it in order to save the team and their mission. Not exactly the most diplomatic solution, and I found it quite funny that a different character comments on Valerian and Horner discussing the implications of the nuke, as how nuking a non-belligerent planet would obviously have serious consequences. Regardless, in spite of this, the team's dropship is incapacitated and they have to continue on foot. At this point, the plot splits into three. There's Valerian and Horner on the Hyperion, and the team moving in on the third quote-unquote tree, and another character, which was secondary so far, Kono Kruskank, who offers an idea to lead a combined Terran and Protoss ground force near the third quote-unquote tree, in order to stop the Zerg returning from the psi emitter from reaching it, or at least to delay them. This plot is pretty interesting, filled with military tactics and the like, and done pretty well, since the Colonel himself is racist against the Protoss, yet he himself comes up with the idea of cooperating with them, and develops as a character in an interesting way. Anyway, the team makes its way to the third and final quote-unquote tree, where they are ordered to take samples from it and compare them with samples from the psionic Zerg, nicknamed Psiolisks, in order to establish that they are not the same species. A battle occurs naturally, tension, more pieces of the mystery are uncovered, and eventually Zagara herself comes to the rescue of the team. By this point, it's pretty much 99% certain that Abathur is the villain, the one who engineered the Psiolisks and this complicated plan, though the Protoss still have doubts because they don't trust Zagara, and his motivations, Abathur's motivations namely, haven't been stated yet. Valerian tricks Zagara into coming on board the Hyperion on her Leviathan alongside the quote-unquote Dream Team. The team then searches the Leviathan and finds Abathur along with the Zerg Queen from the beginning. Abathur tries to defend himself in front of Zagara, but the team presents him with the evidence against him, at which point he, the Queen, and a few hundred Silisks attack Zagara and the team. I must say that it was a fairly interesting final battle, especially since for much of it Zagara is personally dueling Abathur, who actually manages to somewhat stand his ground in hand-to-hand combat. Regardless, Abathur is defeated but not killed by Zagara, as the Swarm does need an evolution master, and negotiations between the three factions resume. The characters of the team, for the most part, are part of the epilogue. In fact, form the main part of the epilogue. Hence why I said that I was frustrated a bit with the ending, since I really wanted to see more of how the negotiations and discussions between Valerian, Artanis and Zagara went on, and to find out what Zagara was going to do with Abathur. Instead, the novel focuses on the characters of the team, which is fine, I suppose just not what I personally wanted. Anyway, let's move on and talk about specific characters. First and foremost, I guess we could start with the main villain, Abathur. Like I mentioned, I pretty much figured out Abathur was the main villain from the second he showed up. Because he's the evolution master, he was constantly obsessed with achieving perfection. Yet Zagara's new course for the Zerg meant that he could not continue his search. Abathur's motivation was to restart the war between the Zerg and the other races and to, hopefully, with the use of the Silisks, destroy the Protoss. He believes that conflict is the key to Zerg evolution, and his attitude and motivations are perfectly in line with the Abathur we see in Heart of the Swarm. Again, I personally know a lot about StarCraft lore, and I also read a lot of the ancillary material, so I don't know if someone with less knowledge than me would realize that Abathur was the villain. Otherwise, there isn't much to say. Abathur acts very much within character, and I like the deceptive turn he took in order to reach his goals. Moving on, I'll talk a bit about the members of the team, then move on to the leaders of the three respective races. The first one, chronologically, is Marine Sergeant Whist. He's pretty much your standard gruff soldier person, and a lot of the story is told from his perspective. He doesn't really develop that much from the story, I don't think, but his interactions with the other characters are fairly interesting and serve to move the plot forward. The next one would be Reaper Lieutenant Diz. Diz doesn't really develop much either, but he has many interesting moments and a lot of cool ones as well, by virtue of being a Reaper with a jetpack. Reapers are, or were at the very least under Emperor Arcturus, composed almost entirely of convicted criminals, and a lot of the interaction between Diz and Whist, while friendly on the surface, is basically Whist trying to figure out the crimes Diz was convicted of. I would mention that Diz is not resucked, he is not panned or brainwashed. He's a criminal who chose to enter the Reaper Corps as a punishment. The novel also ends with him and Whist having a drink in the officer's bar, kind of bookending the things in that way. Next would be the ghost Tanya and the Protoss Ulavu. They are pretty central to the story, especially considering the Silisks use, psi attacks mainly, which affect these two the most, and much of the narrative flow is centered on Tanya. Tanya is a ghost who is retiring, but who has never been on a mission before. During the events of the novel, she displays that she is a pyrotique, namely that she can burn things with her mind, and this is why she was a secret weapon for the Dominion, which was never used. Her character is centered around her fear of losing control of her abilities and her relationship with Ulavu. And after experiencing her first mission, she decides to rejoin the Ghost program. As for Ulavu, I think he might be my favorite not previously established character in the book, though that might really be because I like the Protoss so much. Ulavu is actually something which I'm not going to spoil, and this particular revelation really shakes his relationship with Tanya and provides a really good push for the story. He also can be quite heroic. Ulavu is said to have been disgraced by Protoss society, hence why he is with the Terrans, which does provide an interesting backdrop to the story, namely the question of what he did to warrant said disgrace. Finally, we have Dr. Aaron Wyland. the researcher on the team who has never been in, in combat before. Out of the whole team, I think she's the one who develops the most. She starts the novel by barely managing to control the combat suit she's put in for the mission, but at the end she almost sacrifices her life heroically in order to save the rest of the team, and is injured in the process. She remains throughout the novel the stereotypical nerd on the team, but like I said, manages to gradually develop and grow. One thing I would say about the characters of the team is that there are a few very minor subplots, mostly character development, which is left unfinished. For instance, Dr. Erin is also a racist against the Protoss, and she makes a few comments at the beginning of the story. But near the end of the novel, Ulavu, the Protoss, saves her life. Yet this does not affect the story or prove the irony of her racism in any way. Anyway, a secondary character I'd like to mention is Colonel Crookshank. He is portrayed somewhat like your typical uptight officer, but he actually does have a lot of disrespect for authority and for Emperor Valerian and Matt Horner. In addition, his most defining characteristic is his deeply seated racism against the Protoss. He is, however, a capable military man, and still was willing to work together with the Protoss to achieve their common ends. He's not stubborn in his ways, I suppose you could say, and I thought he was an interesting and not stereotypical or one-dimensional character. Anyway, moving on to the pre-established characters, let's start with Valerian and Matt Horner. Like I said, I liked Valerian's role in the novel as mediator between Artanis and Zagara. However, the author tried to establish a subplot for Valerian, which I don't think worked that well. Namely, Valerian is always questioning himself when he has to make tough decisions, thinking, wait, am I becoming like my father? And in addition, Matt Horner often compares Valerian with his father when Valerian makes said tough decisions. However, this subplot kinda stops halfway through the book. At the end we get a resolution that Valerian realizes that, oh, he's not like his father after all. But we don't really have a clue how he reached that conclusion. Like I said, the subplot stops halfway through and abruptly comes to the end at the ending. Moving on, we have Artanis. Artanis is kind of a secondary character in the story, really. He interacts somewhat with Valerian, and obviously he negotiates with Zagara, but other than that, Artanis is more of a story-developing device rather than a character of his own in the novel, with the exception that he has a bit of a character-developing moment with Valerian. Artanis feels jealous that the Zerg have inherited these Xel'Naga genetics and not the Protoss, and confides in Valerian. Artanis also expresses his thoughts on the dishonor of the Protoss race brought by this, and vows to reclaim said honor, which he at the end claims to have successfully reclaimed. As to the final leader of the bunch, we have Zagara, or Overqueen Zagara as she is now known. I actually really liked Zagara in the book. She is still very much the Zagara we see in game, but she is still very much changed by Kerrigan's teachings and by the freedom of choice granted to her by Kerrigan. I'm honestly surprised that she chose to devote the Swarm to peaceful coexistence and development with the Terrans and Protoss, instead of going the more traditional route of consuming everything like Abathur did. But I don't really mind it, and I like the idea of a cooperative Swarm. I suppose we will see what comes of it in future installments of the franchise. And I suppose this brings us to the end of this opinionated look at StarCraft Evolution. Like I said, it's quite a good book, and I would recommend it to all StarCraft fans, though it does have its flaws. There are still plenty of things I have not spoiled, and it's a book I personally wouldn't mind rereading. Maybe I might have missed something, who knows. Anyway, I'll see all of you later, and farewell.